Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents, a weekly broadcast on Laguna Woods Village TV. Concerned Citizens is an organization dedicated to peace, social justice, economic equality, and a clean environment. Today we are broadcasting an interview with investigative reporter Gerald Posner. Mr. Posner, a lawyer by training and an award-winning journalist by trade, is the author of Pharma, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America. Mr. Posner is interviewed by Mike Ria, CEO of Idea Pharma. The interview provides a unique window into the strengths and weaknesses of America's pharmaceutical industry. It was recorded in August of this year. We hope you enjoy today's program.
So welcome to another in the series of the Pharma Book Club, a series on the Idea Collider podcast. I'm actually delighted to welcome this week Gerald Posner, who is the author of Pharma. I'll let Gerald introduce the subtitle to the book, because originally it was something that I'd looked at and thought, oh, that's going to be one of those pharma bashing books. What I hadn't realized was just how intriguing this was gonna be, and how not that it is. So, Gerald, I'm delighted to welcome you to Idea Collider.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mike. It's great to be on Idea Collider, and interesting that you mentioned the subtitle, because I very seldom have an opportunity when I'm chatting with someone to get a chance to say that was one of the few areas of disagreement I had with my publisher. I'm very lucky to have a publisher in Simon & Schuster that allows me to go off for a few years and try to research a subject. And I had proposed several much less interesting subtitles to them, like a history of the American pharmaceutical industry, because that's really what it is to me. It's a business history. And they opted for what I viewed as a much more sensational and also a misleading one in some ways, because it makes it sound like it's just another bad pharma book. Yep. And made an effort to make it much more just a straightforward history. There are tales in here of great discovery and innovation inside the lab by scientists working hard on cures and fixes. And there are tales of greed in the boardroom and in promotion and marketing, which you wouldn't be surprised at. But I try to make it as balanced as possible.
Yeah, and just for folks that haven't seen the title, so the Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America. Oh, yeah. So it's hence this. So I wonder if this is one of those bad pharma books. But as you say, I think there's a lot more complexity to the story than first appeared. So Gerald, can you tell me something about you and about your, how you came to write this?
Yeah, I'm in another life, it seems. I'm a lawyer, and I'm now everybody's favorite type of attorney. I'm non-practicing, so everybody likes one who doesn't actually practice law. But years ago, in the early 1980s, I was representing on a pro bono suit where you donate your time some twins who had been experimented on at Auschwitz, the largest Nazi concentration camp, by medical experiments by Dr. Joseph Mengele. That suit was unsuccessful, but I had 20 or 25,000 pages of documents that I had gathered in the meantime as part of my research. And I turned it into a book, as a matter of fact, with a UK journalist who then was working for Granada's World in Action. He's now with the BBC, John Ware. And the two of us did a book on Joseph Mengele biography, donated the proceeds to the twins. That came out in 1986. And since then, I've done 13 books. My wife, Tricia, who's British and also an author, has done books. Her last one was The Pharmacist of Auschwitz, about the Romanian ethnic German who ran the dispensary at Auschwitz during the war, and that was published 3 years ago. So we choose projects based upon things that we have a passion about. We've done everything from books about 9/11 to assassinations of American presidents and civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King. And Pharma, the book about the pharmaceutical industry, was one that had been sort of sitting with me since the early 90s. I just needed the time to find a publisher to say, all right, we don't know what your conclusions are. We don't know the story, but we'll allow you to go out for a few years. We'll give you an advance and go out and see what you can find about this history. And it was tough to get that because, Mike, most people wanted an answer beforehand. They wanted you to go to a publisher and say, look, I've got a story about the pharmaceutical industry, and I'm going to say this about vaccines, or I'm going to say this about what I think they're doing on cancer treatments, or I've got a conspiracy story about this. I don't have any of that. I sort of start with a blank slate, and then I let the facts take me where they go, and I build a story from the interviews and the research. I do a few years of research and dozens of interviews, and then start to put the story together. That's what happened here. So it turns out to be a far more fascinating history than I, as a person who was not versed in the sciences, did not have a medical background or a drug industry background, had expected. And and at the same time, one that at times is very frustrating, because you understand the breadth and scope of the great service that's done by the drug industry, and at times how frustrating it is in trying to regulate it.
Yeah, and I guess your background as, I'm going to say, an investigative journalist, I think, comes through this book, and it's a huge book. It's not a quick read. It's an interesting read, but it's not a quick read. I think it's just fair warning for anyone who dives in, because of the scope that you've uncovered.
Mike, somebody did say here, I think only partially tongue in cheek, that it was about the perfect size for a period of self-quarantine. About a 14-day quarantine, you'd just be about perfect.
Yeah, and I think, as we were just discussing, I was hoping to schedule one book a week, and yours was definitely a 2-week book for me. So it was. But the interesting thing is, I've been in this industry for about 30 years, and every page had something that I did not know about this industry and how it got to where it is. So, I think the originality of what's contained is compelling. So.
And I'm sorry to interrupt on that, but if I could say one thing, so as a writer, as somebody who does this, you put your heart and soul into a book, you try to get it right. And on this, my concern was that I was writing about an industry in which the first year was spent essentially in catching up to speed, understanding the technicals of drugs and industries and disease and what happened, so that I could have intelligent conversations and do interviews, and not just look as though I was a layperson who had chosen a topic and didn't understand it. Yeah. The best thing to hear is from people like you, and I get this regularly from doctors who write letters to me, or people involved in the industry who say, I'm involved in this type of research and it was covered well, but I didn't know anything about this, or I was surprised by that. Those types of revelations from people who are there in the industry are the best possible reviews for me, because that tells me that, in the scope of what I was doing, I delivered something that was fresh.
Fresh as well. And I'm going to ask you a question, this right up front. I bet that you wish you were writing it now versus a year ago with a pandemic behind, well, in the middle of a pandemic instead of ahead of it. So.
Yeah, no, it's in publishing, in traditional publishing, if you're not publishing yourself, if you have a company doing it, they put you on their catalog, and they start to sell the book 4 months before to buyers and to book clubs and to that. Before the book is published, they try to sell first serial rights. So this book was set for March 10th publication, late in 2019. It came out on March 10th, and on March 11th, the World Health Organization declared coronavirus a pandemic. So all the bookstores, physical bookstores in the United States, closed. It was an unusual time to publish, to say the least. I would have liked to publish a year later just to avoid that part of the process. But you're right. The problem now would be, if I hadn't published when I did, I wouldn't want to publish now until I knew what was going to happen in terms of the play out of COVID. And we won't know that right away. I think that the false expectation that many in the lay public have is that when they think of vaccine, they think of polio vaccine or something like that. Right. Those of us who are old enough to remember taking the sugar cube, one dosage of an oral vaccine, and that was the end of it. It was 98, 99% effective. That's not going to be the case for those who are following the COVID vaccines. They will be 50 to 70% effective. The FDA in the United States, the Drug Approval Agency, has set the effectiveness level at 50% for approval. So right. The bar is rather low. That would even be mediocre in an influenza injection year. So we're probably going to see a few years to get to herd immunity. It's going to be here for a couple of years. And if I was going to publish about it, I'd like to publish after it was over and looking back in the rearview mirror, because nothing makes you smarter as a writer than being there after it's all played out, and you can look back and know exactly where the errors are. We don't know yet. The countries think they have made mistakes. Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, Mitterrand, they are criticized, for one move or another. We'll know in a year or year and a half which ones were really the bad moves and which ones were the right ones.
Yeah. Yeah, a little bit like the judgment on the French Revolution is it's too soon to say.
Exactly.
So, so maybe this is going to be almost an impossible request, but could you give us a hint of, start to finish, what the book covers over, was it about 50 something chapters?
Yeah, I mean, I expected the book would start with World War II only because that's when penicillin got going. These Oxford researchers that, based upon what this Scottish microbiologist Fleming had discovered in the late 20s, and then is picked up by Heatley and Florey at Oxford, and they have an idea for penicillin. They bring it over to America in the early part of the war, and they need the U.S. pharmaceutical industry and the U.S. government to launch a massive effort to get penicillin going. And it's the true wonder drug. It's one of the great discoveries in human history, no questions. That was my starting point for the industry, I thought. And there's a 6-year period for those who are in the industry. You should mark, I don't think any large industry has ever had a turnaround like this. In 1939, 1 out of every 2 prescriptions written worldwide were dispensed by a German manufacturer, Bayer, Hester, etc. In 1945, in December of 45, 70% of those prescriptions were by 10 American drug companies, and they were making 80% of the world's profits. In 6 years, the industry had turned itself upside down because of the war. The German industry was decimated. The factories were decimated from the bombings. So the American industry became dominant. My mistake was to think that was a starting point because, as you know, I ended up starting nearly 100 years before that in what I call the Wild West days of the drug industry. I didn't realize that the companies in America that we've come to know as second nature, Pfizer, Merck, the American Merck, Johnson & Johnson, Squibb, Eli Lilly, got their start in and about the time of the Mexican-American War and then the Civil War, when there was a huge demand for morphine. And they started up as chemical plants, then shifted to morphine production. And this was a time in America where every drug was legal. Cannabis, the cocaine, the Amazon of our day was the Sears and Roebuck catalog. It, for $1.50, sold you a small amount of pure cocaine and a hypodermic needle. You were able to, all the tinctures and medicines were made with alcohol. Bayer trademarked the name heroin as a cure initially for morphine addiction, after the German word heroisch for heroic. They also developed, by the way, in the same laboratory over a 5-year period, acetaminophen, which you have as paracetamol, and aspirin, a true wonder drug, and barbiturates. They created the entire class in 1903. Their brand name was phenobarbital. The only one of those 4 drugs that they didn't put to market was acetaminophen. They thought that was too toxic, but heroin and barbiturates were fine. All over the counter, no prescriptions required. Anybody over 18 could walk in and get it. And that's how the industry got its start. It was also small, so that in the United States, when a company called Moody's, which measures the size of American corporate sectors, started in 1909 to measure them, it didn't even have pharmaceuticals as a separate sector. It was a subdivision of chemicals. It wasn't until 1929 that it even appeared. And what changed the industry, what brings us up to penicillin, was that at least in America and also in Europe, at the start of World War I, countries started to ban the use of the narcotics, of morphine, of the easy access to heroin. 1914, we do it here. It happens in Britain. It happens throughout Europe and France and in Germany in 1916 and 17. So all of those ingredients used in many of the products are now illegal. The United States goes off and bans alcohol for a while on its great experiment on prohibition. And the drug industry has to reinvent itself. It does come up with insulin in the 1920s in Canada, but Eli Lilly locks that up on a long patent. And so it's not until penicillin that the industry changes and becomes what we know of it as modern times.
And actually, the penicillin story itself is an interesting. I think you separate the invention and the inventors and the kind of discoverers from the innovators and the people who really made it work. And the cantaloupe story, I think, is a very interesting one.
You mentioned that there was a great moment at which a physician ended up writing to me about 2 months ago and said, I thought I knew the penicillin story. I've read it many times, and there were still things in here that were new. And when you say that, one of the things, I'm looking very much at the business part of it. So you get these Oxford researchers who come to America, hat in hand, essentially saying, we hope that you, the Americans, will be able to get behind this. And the American pharmaceutical industry is reluctant to do it. They didn't really want to. It's Pearl Harbor, the attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor, that changes their feelings and they suddenly get involved. And the United States government makes penicillin the second secret priority project during the war. So the number one project was the atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project. Number two, very few people know, was penicillin. The government built the plants, the processing plants, with these enormous fermentation tanks for the companies like Pfizer and others involved. So when the war ended, although there was little money to be made in penicillin because nobody owned a patent on it, which is interesting, the prices went to near zero. It then caused the companies who had the ability to produce massive amounts of antibiotics to look for their own branded drugs. So everybody was then searching for their own antibiotic so that they could put a brand name on it and market it at a much higher price than penicillin. It leads to the hunt for narrow spectrum drugs and also broad spectrum antibiotics like streptomycin. And there's a point in the 50s in which two things happen. In Britain, when they were first talking and developing penicillin, one of the three researchers, Ernst Chain, who had been Eastern European, he said, should we patent this drug? And the British researchers who were working with him were horrified at the thought. They said, how could you possibly do that? That would be, this is a public service. It has to be for the public good. You could never do that. So they dismissed it out of hand. After the war, the American companies put patent processes, these process patents, on the production of penicillin. They said, we can make it faster by doing this. We own a patent on that. We can make it a little bit cheaper by doing this. We own a patent on that. The Brits had to end up paying in many instances on drug companies for those process patents and for the use of them after the war, even though they were the ones who essentially discovered the drug, much to their chagrin. And in the 50s, what the American drug companies do in particular is they take products of rotten fruit, of soil. They're looking for some moldy little microbe inside that might in fact have some antibiotic properties and be able to develop that into a new drug. And the question was in the United States, could you patent a product of nature? So in the 1950s, when the first polio vaccine comes up, Jonas Salk is the inventor. He's asked in a radio program, who owns it? Who owns that patent? And he says, no one. Could you patent the sun? It's his famous quote. I have a chapter titled after that. But for the American drug companies, they needed to get patents on items that they were taking out of simple things like soil. They went before our highest court, the Supreme Court, and the court ruled that if you found the item in nature, but you then did some process to it inside your laboratory or in your plant to make it into a medicine that could be taken in a shot or an inoculation or orally, then you own the rights to it for 17 years in America. That revolutionized the business. And the other thing that revolutionized the business was that a very hard-charging CEO of Pfizer in the late 1950s, who did not have an antibiotic and wanted one, made a copy, essentially, of a competitor's drug. Letterley was a company, and they had a drug called erythromycin. His copy was theromycin. It was one atom of difference between the two. That was all. So no therapeutic difference, no difference in efficacy, no difference in the way that it's administered. Yet the court and the FDA, our Food and Drug Administration, held that it was enough to qualify for its own patent. So what you get in the 50s is this rush of what I call Me Too antibiotics, greatly overdispensed for everything from sore throats to sniffles to whatever else. They're the wonder drugs of the era. They're making money hand over fist. They're leading to some antibiotic resistance, which nobody's really aware of until decades later. But that's the start of what I call the 50s, the beginning of the hard sell for drugs in terms of promotion, and also the entrance of one of the book's real characters, Arthur Sackler.
Yeah, I was literally about to ask you that question, because I think that, I've been aware of Purdue, and it's one of the companies that I have never had any time for within our industry. And clearly they're struggling now, but I had no idea about the origins of the Sackler family or the influence that they've had in so many areas. I just assumed this was a one bad company. But can you tell us more about Arthur Sackler and his kind of fractal influence?
Yeah, Mike, I think one of the amazing things, if you say to me, what was a surprise to you, was that discovery also that there was what I call the Sacklers before OxyContin, because journalists who have covered the Sackler family, who are the private owners of Purdue Pharma, and their star drug, their opioid painkiller since 1996 was OxyContin, $35 billion in sales, the most ever for an opioid painkiller in terms of dollars. But journalists who do the story view them from that point on. Yeah. What do they do? How do they market the drug? Nobody really looked at them beforehand because they figured the Sacklers didn't exist in essence. And it turned out that, I found through Freedom of Information files, which you have an equivalent in the UK. You ask government agencies for release of old files if somebody's passed away, and they go through a process and take a few years, and then they finally send you some things. They were a veritable gold mine in this, because the Sacklers end up, the three brothers who were the founders of the family, and two who were there still alive when OxyContin came out. But they revolutionized drug advertising as the industry knows it, for better or for worse. For better, if you're the drug companies, because you sold more drugs. Maybe for worse, if you're the doctors getting bombarded with a lot of these clever ads. But they were investigated. The Sacklers were psychiatrist brothers. All three were psychiatrists. They were the first in their family, Eastern European immigrants, to ever go to college. Two of the brothers had to leave New York. They grew up in Brooklyn, had to leave New York to go to medical school in Glasgow, because the New York University Medical School had filled its quota for Jews. Jews and blacks had a very tight quota back then and weren't allowed in. But those three brothers worked for a while at the largest state mental asylum in New York, Creedmoor, 8,000 beds. And then Arthur, the lead brother, the oldest of the brothers, they're all sort of card-carrying members of the American Communist Party, very dedicated leftists during this time. He goes into medical advertising, and he's investigated by the Senate, the U.S. Senate in the early 60s. They talk about a Sackler empire in 1962. That's 44 years before OxyContin was ever dreamed of dozens of companies that the Sackler brothers owned, medical companies, medical advertising companies, testing firms to try to determine which doctors were dispensing the most medications. They were far ahead of their time. And it was Arthur Sackler, Mike, who went to Jack McKean, the CEO of Pfizer, with his drug terramycin, which is just a copy essentially of aramycin, and said, I can make that drug the best-selling antibiotic in America if you give me $7.5 to $10 million as a promotion budget. And McKean thought that was mad, because nobody spent that type of money on launching a drug. But Sackler had some unusual ideas, which today we take for common. He wanted to start up what he called detail team, which at that time were all men, but it's men and women who are the salespeople, go out and visit the doctors. He wanted to send out free samples of the drug. It hadn't been done before then. He wanted to send out what was called some pharmaceutical swag, gifts to doctors. The ideas of creating over the next few years a small speakers bureau. The doctors who specialized in that medicine might be able to be paid an honorarium of several $1,000s to go and speak in Bermuda in the middle of winter in New York, and that would encourage them to write more prescriptions. And he said to McKean, you as an industry, you're old-fashioned. You're advertising to doctors in medical journals like the Journal of the American Medical Association or Lancet by reprinting the insert of the drug that's sent out to pharmacists. It's the most boring thing in the world. You need to use Madison Avenue techniques, 4-color ads, multi-page, pull-out ads, advertise in general research magazines as well. Spend money on saturating the market, even though you're just selling to doctors. And McKean hired Sackler, who ran that ad campaign. He made terramycin the #1 drug in America. Other companies started to emulate it, but Arthur Sackler then went on to Hoffman La Roche, and he got Valium to become the first $100 million drug in the drug industry history and the first $1 billion drug in terms of cumulative sales. He made Valium the #1 selling drug in the world from 1963 to 1978, 15 years. It's an unparalleled effort. So he really revolutionized the marketing and promotion of pharmaceuticals, not only in the US, but also to some extent in Europe.
Yeah, and as you say, there's so much I didn't know there. One thing I had no idea of, even as you were writing it, was just I'm going to say the nefarious influences, right? So, advertising is one thing. It feels like it's legit and it's upfront and its approach. But the relationships with the FDA, the stuff that sat behind the scenes, where the kind of medical information services and so forth. Could you give us a hint of, the kind of Sackler influence that was unseen in that iceberg?
Yeah, it's so interesting because there's a point in there that's long forgotten in American drug industry history. And I guarantee that if I stopped 100 Americans on the street and asked them about this, if one remembered, it would be unusual. And that is that the chief of antibiotic approval, that division inside the Food and Drug Administration, there was no more important seat for approval, a division chief in all of the American regulatory system in the 1950s than antibiotics, because it was the top selling class of drugs. Arthur Sackler had a very clever idea. He went into partnership where he had a hidden interest with this sort of Spanish polyglot who was himself a psychiatrist they started a series. They took over a failing medical journal, and they opened up a new series of medical journals, and they hired the head of the FDA's antibiotics division for an honorarium for editing it, and he would be paid only a small amount. That's what he reported back to the FDA, and the FDA approved it. Then they started to give him a percentage of the money, and he was making the equivalent of what would be $6 to $7 million a year. Now, he never reported that back to the FDA. And what they did in the Sackler-owned enterprises in these journals is they chose articles that gave not just a good spin to the drugs, but a good spin to the drugs that Arthur Sackler had as clients. And then those clients would buy reprints of those journals, in some cases, tens of thousands of reprints, because it was such a good piece. They would distribute them to doctors, and the Sackler Journal and the FDA chief would make more money. Eventually, when that became public before the Senate, it was a big disgrace. The FDA chief had to resign. Sackler, of course, emerged unscathed, as he often did. And it's just one, as you know, of many stories in there. I mean, he's got a case in which he has 2 x-rays shown to produce, to emphasize one drug being good. And one doctor writes in and says, in this ad, I don't think those x-rays are of the same person. So he's asked about this before the Senate. It turns out not only are they of different people, the before the disease picture and the one that's cured by the medication, but neither one had taken the medication. And when asked about that by an investigator, Sackler just shrugs it off and says, nowhere in the ad does it say that these represent people who have taken my client's drug. This is just representative of what someone would look like if they were ill and what they would look like if they had taken the drug. There's nothing misleading about it. He pressed the boundary of what would be considered ethical advertising to doctors to the breaking point time and time again, and got away with it.
Yeah, and that comes across very strongly as this kind of shamelessness with which, as you talk about the changes in ownership of the companies that he was involved with. I mean, I hadn't realized where IMS had started as a kind of sales reporting service and a segmentation and physician targeting service. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, IMS, which today we think of it as one of the world's great collectors of medical data. It's a public company, but had its start, as a matter of fact, with a Wolfgang Froelich, a German immigrant who had arrived in the United States in the mid-30s. He became fast friends with Arthur Sackler, and he owned a competing ad agency. It turns out he changed his name to Bill Froelich, and he was in fact a Jewish immigrant, but hid the fact he was Jewish. Got admitted to a number of anti-Semitic country clubs, as a matter of fact, in promoting his work. And Arthur Sackler also played down his Jewishness, interestingly enough, in the 50s. The drug industry in America was very much a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant domain. And so it was not an area where there were many hard-charging, successful Jews, and both of them played that down. Froelich had an idea for IMS, and that's what he called it, as a matter of fact. It was to collect in a very rudimentary way which doctors were prescribing which prescriptions. And it turned out to do that, he had to actually pay pharmacists in the end a small amount of money so that they would report to him that numbers. They would say, okay, we're getting streptomycin written by this doctor on Park Avenue in New York City. He seems to be writing more prescriptions than anybody else in that zip code. And then he would be paid for passing that information along. There was no law against it. That was the start of it. And Arthur Sackler had a hidden interest in it. Years later, that interest gets paid out in a will from Froelich. But the part of it that's so amazing is what you said a moment ago. These men were ahead of their time in terms of understanding how to market. Because before that, this is an unusual business. The manufacturer of the product is not selling directly to the end consumer, the patient. They have to go through these middle people, doctors. So men and women who are physicians have to prescribe the medication before it can then be sold in the final case to the patient at a pharmacy. So the drug manufacturers had considered that they would just have to sort of blast it out through Lancet, the Journal of the American Medical Association, the specialized publications at doctors in general, and maybe subspecialties to the extent that there were those journals. What Sackler said to them is, if you find the information, if you pay for it to find out which doctors are prescribing the most, the top 5 to 10% of doctors may prescribe, depending on the medication, 40 or 50% sometimes of what's going out, especially with pain medications later on. Concentrate on them. Don't waste your time on the others. Don't waste your time on the ones who aren't writing it. And when that became a mantra inside the industry, it changed the way that drugs were marketed.
And then as you get into I'm going to say the industry operating as an industry, trying to stop legislation, trying to stop regulation, trying to stop the imposition of any kind of control on prices and so forth. That seems to emerge around that same time as the regulators almost catch up with that, and you described that very well as well.
Yeah, I think that, look, there's no question that if there's a success story in terms of lobbying for influence, it is the nod must be given, or the medal or award or ribbon, to the American pharmaceutical industry, which has so far been able to keep the United States as the only country on the planet that allows drug companies unfettered pricing power. So you can set whatever price you want for your drug, and if it's too high, the market won't bear it, and insurance won't pay for it, then you'll have to adjust your price, but nobody's going to tell you to do that. That's your decision. So there's no National Health Service, there's no government entity negotiating prices, there's no group of doctors appointed by the government to look into it. It's really remarkable. And that's not just because of luck. It's not just because nobody's ever thought of doing anything on prices, because every time that's come up as a possibility, the American industry fought it back. And the closest we ever came to having what I call a European model, an overgeneralization of some checks on prices and some controls, was in the early 1960s with a crusading Tennessee senator, Estes Kefauver, who had gone after the mafia previously, and then he had 2 years of hearings. He's the one who includes Sackler in the hearings. He really wanted to shorten the amount of duration for a patent in the US from 17 years, it's now 17 to 20, to 5 years. And he wanted to put in checks on, give the government some power to control pricing. And the pharmaceutical industry chopped that bill up. And what changed it, it changed completely from pricing in 1962 when thalidomide scandal broke out. You'll all remember in Europe, it was over-the-counter, basically, as an over-the-counter calming aid sold to expectant mothers who were having morning sickness. And then, of course, the side effect was that many had these horrific deformities on children that were born. It was not approved in the United States for sale because it was held up by the Food and Drug Administration. And as a result of that, that scandal broke in the middle of the hearings over the pricing bill. Everybody in politics in America forgot about pricing and immediately was reactive and focused on health and safety. So that bill became the bill that in 1962 established the clinical trials that we now are seeing with COVID and everything else, in which drugs had to go through 3 different levels of clinical trials, each one larger, to establish not only safety, but efficacy. And Mike, this is my favorite part. Think of this, 1962, this law comes into effect. I said, and efficacy. That means beforehand, before 1962, a drug did not have to show that it did what the manufacturer claimed it did. Didn't have to show that it was therapeutic. You could say that it was effective for stopping the common cold, or that it was effective for reducing fevers or for osteoarthritis. You didn't have to prove that. You just have to prove that it didn't kill anybody. The safety regulations weren't involved in clinical trials. So when 1962 comes in America, it's a major change, because now you not only have safety regulations going forward in clinical trials, but because you have to prove that it's therapeutic and has some efficacy, the government had to go back to the FDA and look at the 4,000 medications that had been approved since 1938, when we first required prescriptions. So no prescriptions required before 38 until 1962, when this law was passed. Those 4,000 medications, this is my favorite little footnote in the book almost, those 4,000, it turns out that 65% of them turn out to be useless when they're actually looked at in terms of efficacy. They're withdrawn from the market. The government takes off a whole bunch of these combination antibiotics. So it's remarkable that a lot of the drugs being sold through the 50s and early part of the 60s didn't even do what they claimed they would do.
And that was an interesting sort of part of this as well, which is you made comments about George Merck and others, and their sort of, we do this for the good of the patient. But that switch to, well, actually, there's a lot of money on this. So things like the combination antibiotics, which seem to have been created in order to, generate revenue rather than to be good for anybody. I mean, that's an interesting sort of discovery for this industry as well, this addiction to profit.
Yeah, it seems to me that what the companies, at least in the U.S., have to do, and this is to some extent in Europe, but the U.S., it becomes their mantra, their holy grail, is how do we get a patent on it? How do we own a brand name that we can charge more for an exclusive period of time? We get a monopoly selling power. essentially for the length of that patent. And that is the quest. So combination antibiotics were fantastic because they literally would combine an antibiotic. Sometimes it would combine two antibiotics that had come off a patent. So you now have two drugs that were generic. The prices had dropped very, very low. You combine those two in some combination inside the lab. You claim that it enhances their healing power because there's a synergistic power between the two of them. You now can get a brand name patent on that for 15, 17 years going forward, even though you haven't done anything other than put those two drugs together. Sometimes they were putting together expired patent antibiotics with an over-the-counter drug. It turns out that when they did the efficacy, the studies and the health and safety studies later on those drugs, some of them were more dangerous because the combination of the two drugs not only didn't afford you any extra healing power, but the synergy between them was to create more side effects. They actually heightened some of the side effects for people. They were a bit more dangerous. They had a higher side effect profile. So it was very, very interesting that all they were looking for in some cases was the ability to put a name on it, get a patent on it, and sell it at a higher price.
Yeah, and linked to that is this kind of, sometimes good things turn into very bad things. So, I mean, I want to come back to the kind of Sackler influence on pain and addiction as a problem, because that has its origins, way back when. I think you described, the UK being part of this as well with NAP and other entities. Could you give us a sense of the sweep of problems that we see today?
And even, and just one side, but even before pain, you see Arthur Sackler's lead hand on what I call targeting women. And that's the name of one of the chapters, in which he essentially uses these U.S. Army experiments in the 1950s on monkeys to say, oh, well, we can understand from these electric jolts given to monkeys in this experiment and the way that autopsies are done on them afterwards, that the monkey under the most stress, what he called the executive monkey, those are men. This is late 1950s, early 60s. Men are the breadwinners. They have to go out and earn all the income for the household. They have to appear strong for the rest of society, and they can never show any weakness. As a result, when they're under stress, they get ulcers and they get heart disease. Women, on the other hand, they're at home doing housework. They need Adderall to do it faster, and they need things like Librium and Valium because they're neurotic and hysterical. And he literally had a series of campaigns for Hoffman and Roche and others in which the ads would show a woman doing a vacuum cleaner faster on Adderall, in which they would have, for instance, a 35-year-old woman, single and neurotic because she couldn't find someone to marry and she was better off on Valium. It was the marketing of the first oral contraceptive, the pill, which starts in 1960, and hormone replacement therapy by Wyeth and by Cyril, those drugs. Those drug companies hid the side effects of increased risk of cancer and increased risk of blood clots for 15 years in America. Hundreds of thousands of women affected here and abroad. So the story of Arthur Sackler and the marketing of drugs toward women was successful from the drug company's viewpoint. Hoffman and Roche, 70% of their prescriptions for Valium went to women. So yes, it worked, but doctors who were prescribing them were not psychiatrists, but were now the general practitioners, where the doctors were primary care physicians who didn't really know that much about the drugs. So a woman would come in and say she's a little depressed after having had a baby, or she was a little anxious about this, or didn't feel she could handle the whole household, she'd get a Valium prescription. And Arthur Sackler's handiwork was there. And it plays into the way that they eventually at Purdue and the pain industry deal with pain. So it's Cicely Saunders, a British nurse turned physician who only becomes a physician because another doctor tells her she wants to start the modern hospice movement. And he says to her in the early 60s, no one's going to pay any attention to you in the hierarchical British medical system if you're just a nurse. You should become a physician. And she says, all right. And she does. And it's a remarkable story. And Cicely Saunders becomes a doctor, starts St. Christopher's in London in the mid 60s. But the holy grail for her is to find a pain medication that lasts longer than 4 to 5 hours. Because otherwise you have these terminal cancer patients with end-of-life pain so crippling that they can't leave the hospital ward because they have to be administered hospital pain medication, sometimes by IV, every 4 to 5 hours. So she's looking for a long-acting pain reliever so she could send these patients home. They could die in hospice care, but with their loved ones at home. And that is fulfilled, that look for a long-acting pain reliever, by a Sackler-owned company, NAP Pharmaceuticals in the UK, which they have owned since the 1950s. And NAP produces this long-acting MS Continuous, was the name of the product, morphine, 12 hours was the claim, with an invisible polymer coating over the pill. And it did revolutionize the pain medication treatment for end-of-life cancer patients and the hospice movement. That drug becomes MS Contin in America, and it produced here in the 80s. It runs into, as you said, a reevaluation of opioids. A group of pain doctors at Sloan Kettering, which is the leading cancer hospital, one of the leading cancer hospitals in America out of New York, said pain is underdiagnosed. We should be looking at pain as a standalone symptom and treat it as such. And that became widespread in the medical world. It became the fifth vital sign. If you go as a patient to a doctor in America for your annual checkup, you get your heart rates taken, your pulse, you get your blood pressure taken. They ask you, are you in any pain today? On a 1 to 10 scale, how would you rate it? I don't know if that happens in the UK, but it certainly happens here, and it made pain stand out as an item to be treated. And these same doctors said, we think opioids have been tarred and feathered for too long. They aren't as addictive as we thought in the past. That dovetailed into the beginning of OxyContin, which was a Purdue product in which the Sackler family said, we want a long-acting pain reliever that doesn't include morphine. Because people hear morphine, they think end of life. So they use oxycodone as the active ingredient, which chemically is similar to heroin. It's very similar. And that was what was packaged as OxyContin. And they, meaning Purdue and the Sacklers, sold that drug in light of the new reappraisal of opioids for all types of pain, including for pain that hadn't even been approved for by the FDA, including osteoarthritis, terrible back pain, pain from work. They targeted veterans and the Veterans Association. They went after opioid naive people who had never tried opioids before. They said to doctors, they had a doctor come up with a theory called pseudo-addiction, one of my favorites. And I don't mean favorite is good. He said, if you're a doctor and you're prescribing OxyContin, an opioid painkiller, and your patient appears to be addicted because they want more and more, and they're clamoring for it, and they're having little bits of what looks like withdrawal if they're not getting it, that's not addiction. That's pseudo-addiction. You are witnessing somebody who looks to have all the elements of addiction, and the cure to that is not to cut them off of opioids, but is to double the dose, give them more. And as remarkable and as silly as that may sound, it worked. So they actually had a program at Purdue called Up to Dose, and they did that time and time again. They made much more money as the doses went up. And you watch this play out over time. It's like a slow moving train wreck. You see it happening in 2007, 11 years after the drug was out. Purdue Pharma, and a lot of people listening may forget this, pleaded guilty to criminal felony charges in America for misbranding and over-marketing the drug. 3 top executives stepped down. They paid tens of millions of dollars in fines, and the company paid $600 million in fines. And guess what? The next year in 2008, they doubled down and they started to advertise and do their marketing even more aggressively. So this is only in the last few years that the death toll, the amount of the addiction, the millions addicted, has come to light. And I think Purdue's OxyContin is not the only problem in this business, but became the poster child for this epidemic.
Yeah, and the kind of origins, or among the origins of this, you talk about Valium and the kind of medicalization of anxiety, which at the time was an under-recognized or not recognized at all thing, and actually helping GPs understand that the patients that they were seeing were patients with anxiety. So one thing that was kind of interesting to me was how much of what we almost take for granted today, that diseases need education campaigns, they need, X, Y, and Z, as you say, the kind of the medicalization of pain and so forth. It has for 50 years been part of the construct of a kind of Sackler-like campaign to introduce products to people that otherwise might not have wanted or needed them.
Yeah, that's right. And one of the things that happens in America in particular, where you have, as opposed to a government distribution of medication and government approval of medication, here you have this system that's a hodgepodge built on private insurance, and the government covers some at the bottom of the system who don't have any money under a program called Medicaid, and there's some coverage for those over 65 provided on Medicare, but it's limited. But what happens is you have somebody like the Sacklers, let's say, taking Valium in 63, 64, 65. He's really selling that off-label. So in the US, a doctor can write a prescription, dispense a drug that's been approved for one condition for any other condition that doctor deems it might be useful for, and not be held responsible if it doesn't turn out to be very good. So The doctors, for instance, took a drug, Botox, which was by Allergan, which was for controlling spasms in the throat, and were writing it off-label for years for cosmetic purposes to reduce crow lines around people's eyes, and eventually got approved by that because the drug company went ahead and approved it. A drug that was originally put out by, for heart control, in controlling hypertension, turned out to have a side effect that it had erections with men and became Viagra after a time because it was being dispensed by doctors off-label. So what Sackler encouraged doctors to do was to encourage them to write prescriptions, especially for the benzodiazepines, the anti-anxieties, the Xanax, which came later, off-label. Although it was approved for X, you could really dispense it for a whole host of things for which you didn't know it. However, in the US, insurance companies won't pay for it unless it's a recognized disease that has a little code that the doctor can write in on the form, so it comes back as insurance. And that comes in 1980 when the third, and then eventually we have the fourth and fifth DSMs, the diagnostics, statistical manuals, the psychiatric manuals, medicalize anxiety, PTSD, a whole host of subgroups of anxiety, social anxiety disorder, SAD, and others. Once those get medicalized officially, then they become covered by insurance in the US. And if you look at the dates on which those items become what I call officially medicalized, even though doctors were writing prescriptions for them before, the sales zoom after that because the companies are able to get doctors to write much more because patients don't have to pay as much.
Yeah, and simply that they're recognizing stuff that they otherwise couldn't put a name to or
that's right.
Prescription to. So I realize this is a long list of my own ignorance, but the other thing I had no idea about was the origins of the PBMs. So I'm aware of PBMs. I had no idea of the linkage to pharma at the beginning. So the two. I kept getting surprised as well through the book, and I guess the two areas. One called Orphan Drugs, and maybe we could talk about that later. It's a peculiar thing in the U.S., but also PBMs, so pharmacy benefit managers. I didn't realize it was. I knew they existed. I see them as large, multi-billion-dollar companies here in America with Caremark and others. Caremark owned by CBS, with its Dutch origins. But I didn't realize they were really an invention from the 1980s. And they started out as what I call, I guess, the equivalent, Mike, of a payroll processor. You're running a small company and you've got 20 employees or 30 employees. And now it's gotten to the point where it's not as easy for you to do the books and do the payroll and watch out for things. So these companies come along and say, we'll do the payroll for you. We'll make sure everybody gets paid on time. We'll make sure that deposits are made directly to their accounts. We'll pay the quarterly taxes. We'll file the returns for you. So those forms, that's what the original PBMs were. They came to the insurance companies and they said, we can do the processing for you. We can make it easier to the drug companies on making sure that the applications are done correctly. You get reimbursed and your drug is prescribed. They moved from becoming what I call administrators, bureaucrats, into holding and wielding real power because they saw the pitfalls and the weaknesses in the American system. So that insurance companies said, we will pay for drugs that are on our own list, our formulary. And that formulary will be something that doctors help to choose. The PBM said, we can help you choose that. And once the PBMs, the pharmacy benefit managers, got control of the formularies for the major insurance companies in America, they started to control the middle of the drug distribution process in an unusual way because they decided which drug ended up on a formulary. It doesn't have to be the cheapest. It doesn't have to be the most effective. There can be 4 competing, for instance, for controlling cholesterol. And the drug that they put on might be the result of a rebate that they end up getting from the manufacturer, which isn't disclosed to anyone because it's not required by law, although the Trump administration is trying to change that. So the rebate gets to the PBM, makes them a ton of money. The patient suffers at the end by paying more for the drug than they might otherwise have to. The pharmacist at the very bottom of the chain, the drug distribution chain, loses out because they're getting squeezed by the pharmacy benefit managers. The drug company's happy because they're selling their drug, and the pharmacy benefit managers are now a multi-billion-dollar middle slice of the industry. And we wonder why in America we have the highest drug prices in the world, 3 to 16 times more expensive than any other country. PBMs are part of the reason. Yeah, and I think that sort of dysfunctional, perverse incentive that represents that U.S. market. I mean, you mentioned orphan drugs. I'm keen to get there before we run out of time, which isn't very long now. So we've gone very quickly through this. So because the risk is that this feels historical, right? This feels like a bad old Pharma, or it feels like we could take a route through the kind of, the Purdue and Sackler family. Everyone likes to demonize someone that's not like us. The rest of us are okay. I think orphan drugs tell us that that's not true. Could you give us a hint of?
Yeah, and also, there are things in here, and this when I talk about biotech firms and Genentech, and the first the arrival of artificial insulin and how they do it, these breakthroughs in biotech, the promise down the road for cancer treatments in biotech that's there, which we aren't talking about, but there's chapters, and that promise is some of the biggest potential of, I think, what's coming up in the drug industry in the future. But very interesting on orphan drugs. Orphan drugs are really meant to, it's a law in the early 1980s. The intent of the law was good, as many laws are. The unintended consequences, the problem. So the law was intended to encourage pharmaceutical companies to develop drugs for small patient populations that were afflicted with rare genetic diseases. So maybe it was a group of people with Huntington's disease, and the number of patients might only be 10 or 15,000. No drug company was spending the effort to develop a drug for that because they figured there wasn't enough money in it. They'd rather develop a drug for a chronic condition like diabetes or heart disease or blood pressure because they could have millions or tens of millions of people for years on their drug. So the US government said, we're going to encourage you to do it. We'll give you financial incentives. Money always helps. We'll help subsidize some of your research. We'll give you tax credits. We'll put you on a fast approval process for the drug. You'll get a quick 7-year patent on the drug right off the bat with no competition from anyone else. And as a result, it brought in quite a few companies to start to do work on these genetic illnesses, which is fantastic. The problem is that of the top 10 most expensive drugs in the world in 2019, 8 of them were orphan drugs. They're serving very small patient populations, but they are priced very high because the manufacturers have now learned the trick, which is they go back sometimes for 2 or 3 slices of the same apple. They cut the patient population even smaller. They say, before it was Huntington's disease, but now it's pediatric Huntington's disease. We're only dealing with 14 and under. Essentially, it's the same drug rejiggered a little bit. They sometimes take the orphan drug and get it approved for a mass drug, as Allergan did with Botox, and they don't have to pay anything back. But what they do very well, and they do it with the NHS, they come forward, Novartis, and they have a drug, let's say, and they say, we're looking at something here that might be helpful, and we're going to price this drug at $2 million. The NHS will say, in essence, all right, sorry about the siren in the background. The NHS will essentially say, before we consider whether that price is reasonable or not, show us what it will cost us as National Health Service to treat that patient on a given lifespan for the treatment that they're receiving for that condition, cystic fibrosis for others. If the cost of the drug is a markedly less than what the treatment is expected to be, the government will sometimes approve it, or they'll negotiate a lower price. So the companies have become very, very adept at being able to do that. And for the first time, for your listeners, we've seen a company do it outside of orphan drugs on COVID. Gilead has applied that philosophy to remdesivir, which is now marketing and selling. It said, by the way, it gets you out of the hospital, according to studies, 4 days earlier. In the United States, that's a $12,000 savings. So therefore, since we save you $12,000, we'll price the drug at $2,400 in the U.S., $3,200 in the U.S., and $2,400 abroad. It's always more in the U.S. Because we're saving you $9,000. It's never been the way that the drug industry has priced drugs, because if I get an infection, bacterial meningitis, I'm about to die, I go into the hospital and they give me antibiotics to save my life. Those antibiotics might cost $40. Right. But should they charge me $3,000 because I got out of the hospital faster? I didn't die. I'm going to make some contribution to society. We've never priced drugs based upon the value versus what the cost would otherwise be. We do it on orphan drugs, and companies have gotten good at doing it. We've never done it with other drugs, but we see it for the first time on COVID with remdesivir.
Oh, it's interesting. I know Peter Bach has written about that exact problem. I wish we had more time. This hour has kind of flown by. I'd like to maybe finish by just saying that although this feels like a it's a harsh discovery of the skeletons in our own closet. It also feels like an empowering one because, as you say, there are a lot of great things within our industry, and if we're going to be better, I think it's important that we recognize the kind of, the siren calls that often afflict us. Is that where you landed?
Yeah, no, absolutely. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be talking to a group of pharmacists early next year, if COVID allows it. Personal talk, otherwise it'll be. And part of it is on how the industry can make itself better, because I actually think there's a roadmap here. And the reason I say that is what I find inspiring, the great stories about the drug industry, are those inside the laboratory. It is the selfless researchers and scientists who are really working hard to be able to find those cures and treatments. Then there's a disconnect sometimes when the drug passes over to the sales and marketing department. So it's almost a Jekyll and Hyde type thing. I mean, you see people inside on Orphan Drugs in that chapter who are talking about a drug and they actually say on Ashtar, for instance, this drug that was turned around, we never expected to be marketed like this. So the people who develop the drug don't think it's going to be marketed like that. There are two different arms. And I understand that. These are for-profit companies. I have nothing against that. They're public companies. They have to make returns for the shareholder. They do that very well. They have healthy profit margins. Nobody should take that away from them. And most of the time they do it correctly. But occasionally they do go over the boundary. And when they do, they should be held to task, and we should try to improve the industry in the future by making sure it doesn't happen again.
No, and that's part of my hope is that, actually I'm hoping this pandemic and the kind of review of business as usual is conducted with a view to, some of the practices, certainly the sales side and maybe the marketing side, but because I think our industry's reputation has been damaged not by the R&D folks, or by the kind of research folks, the lab scientists, but by, a lot of these tales are from the kind of pull from the marketplace.
No question. And one last very quickly as we wrap up, just to note, we, the United States, are one of two countries on the planet, New Zealand being the other crazy one, that allows direct-to-consumer advertising. We started that in 1997. And, pharmaceutical companies say we need all these profits for research and development. But as I point out, if you take the top 10 largest pharma companies in the world, all public companies, they spend more on average on stock buybacks and research and promotion than they do actually on marketing, on research in the lab. And I always say a few less stock buybacks and a little less promotion and advertising, and you can still do the same good research in your laboratories.
Absolutely. And, things like lobbying in DC. Pharma is by an order of magnitude the largest lobbyist in DC. So and it shows in this sense that in the beginning of COVID, the government passed the first emergency bill, was $8.3 billion, $3 billion in late March, went to drug companies for research on vaccines. There was two early clauses in the bill. One was to give the government real power to come down if they thought the price of an eventual vaccine was too high. And the other said all the research is shared. No one owns it. Both of those clauses were taken out when the bill was passed in an emergency session. So I just want people to know it's not just the Republicans. It's not just the Democrats. Both political parties in America have been beholden to the drug industry lobby for a long time. The lobby is very effective on both sides of the political aisle. Fantastic. I feel like I want to read. I wish you were serializing, month by month as this goes. So, Gerald, if people want to find out more about you and about the book, what's the best place for them to go?
The best place is actually a website. It's just Posner, my last name, POSNER.com. And there's a page there on Pharma, which has some appearances. It'll have this podcast, the Pharma Collider at one point, and it has reviews and articles and other information. It has also information on my other books and what's coming up next. I have no idea yet, but I'm still in the world of pharma.
Fantastic. I appreciate it so much. And we'll include as many links as I can find on the show notes that go out with this. So, Gerald, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mike, for having me. I really appreciate it.